This week, we're talking about what to do when everything feels annoying.
You are listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It, the podcast for ambitious, high-achieving women who are ready to stop feeling stressed about work and kiss burnout goodbye forever. Whether you're starting a business or staying in your day job, this show will give you the coaching and guidance you need to start loving your work today. Here's your host, career coach Corey Lynn.
Hey, y'all. I'm excited to talk to you this week about something that I've actually been getting coaching on myself lately. But before I jump into it, I wanted to share with y'all that this is actually the second time I'm recording this podcast. And that's because the first time I recorded it, the topic, the way I described it was when everything feels dumb. And I described it that way because that's like literally, those were the words my brain was saying, was like, everything is dumb. And my wonderful podcast team at Digital Freedom Productions reached out and they were like, hey, I think you might want to know that this word has a history you may not be aware of when you're using it. And they were right. It had totally slipped my mind that this word is ableist. And they were right. I think I did know somewhere deep in the depths of my brain that like the history of this word was ableist, but I think it had slipped my mind, or I don't really know what happened. But the point is, I wanted to share that with all of y'all because I wanted you to know that these things happen to me also, right? I make a lot of mistakes, or I do things that I don't even realize are mistakes until someone else comes along and says, hey, did you know this has this implication? I know language matters a lot to you. I thought maybe you didn't know, and I didn't know. So I just want to give such a big shout out of gratitude to Angela, who's on my team at Digital Freedom Productions. And I have a lot of people on my team there and they're all amazing, but it was specifically Angela who messaged me on Slack this morning and mentioned that. And I was like, let me re-record that immediately because language does matter so deeply to me and because I'm not always going to get things right. And when I don't get things right, I want to fix them. I want to have a new decision to think about like, what are my values here? And then act from those values. And I think being able to approach this situation with that attitude is such an example of everything I've done with coaching and the differences in me as someone who's done a very large amount of coaching in the last several years, because I did feel embarrassed when I realized what had happened, but I didn't feel the giant surge of shame that I am certain I would have felt 3 or 4 years ago. I didn't feel like I had fucked everything up beyond all recognition. I was like, oh shit, that is not what I want to have happen. And then within, I would say 5 minutes, I was like, oh, I am deeply grateful. And that is so fun. And I didn't actually have to coach myself on that at all. I didn't have to force that at all. It was pretty natural. But by natural, let me be really clear about what I mean by that. By natural, I mean over years of self-coaching and being coached by amazing coaches, I have changed my thought patterns from these thought patterns of deep shame to these thought patterns of oh, okay, this is manageable and maybe there's even something here that I can be grateful for. And so if you're doing a lot of coaching or coaching yourself or trying to change your thought patterns and the thought you want to feel natural doesn't feel natural yet, that's okay. That doesn't mean anything has gone wrong. I would say keep practicing, because I've been practicing these thought patterns not consistently always. You know, my take on consistency is consistent inconsistency, however we can do it. But I've been practicing them a lot for several years, sometimes hyper consistently and sometimes sort of half-assedly. And I think both of those are okay and useful because we usually can't be hyper consistent all the time. As we all know, I teach and preach about that all the time. Anyways, the point is, this is such an example of what coaching can do. And also such a good example of we're always going to have shit that we do that someone's going to be like, wait a minute, did you know this? And we're going to be like, oh, fuck, I didn't know that. Or we're going to realize after the fact that what we did didn't align with our values. And I want to speak openly about that, even though part of me is like a little embarrassed to tell y'all and to admit to y'all and everyone that like I made that mistake. What I think is more important than my embarrassment is my ability to lead by example, which of course feels vulnerable when I'm doing it. But I think that's important because I want y'all to see that when I'm talking about like being imperfect and living the human condition, I am also being imperfect and living the human condition. And I'm doing it all the time. It's not like I'm just talking about past Corey who was imperfect and living the human condition. No, the person I am right now is imperfect and living the human condition. And the person I'm going to become will be imperfect and will be living the human condition. And I think that's so essential for me to talk about too, because when someone becomes like a coach or an influencer and is teaching other people stuff that's really impactful and important and can help them have a much better experience of their lives, I think sometimes people, like especially coaches, kind of get put on this pedestal and people think we're like living perfect lives over here or something. And that's just nothing could be further from the truth. And I want y'all to know and be with me in the knowledge that like I'm imperfect and learning and figuring it out. And like I know some incredibly useful shit. And I'm going to share everything I know with you. And it's also okay if sometimes you're like, what the fuck? Or I don't think Corey is informed about blah, blah, blah. That's okay too. I'm not perfect. I'm not informed about everything. I'm in process. And that's all I can ever be, which isn't at all to excuse it. Like if I do something that is incorrect, I'm going to, do my best to be accountable for it and to communicate it to everyone like I am right now. But it just means like, I think it's important to remember that our teachers are not perfect, even when they're useful and have really great ideas. Like we're also just people and we don't have all the knowledge and we're figuring it out as we go. And I do think something I've actually been thinking a lot about in my own life is about the specific vulnerability of putting all of my teachings out there in the world in this way where like, as long as the podcast stays up, people 5 years from now could come and listen. And I'm sure that there will be some things in like the podcast and my teachings that 5 years from now I'll go like, I wouldn't teach that way. Or like, oh, I've actually totally changed my stance on that. And yet I put this stuff out there anyway. And I think that's because it's like, I can either put nothing out or I can put out my like current ideas that I know may evolve. And some of them I might be really proud of in 5 years. And some of them I might be like, oof, I have a really different idea on that. And sometimes it is like, then we find out, oh no, I used a word that I wouldn't use anymore. Or I said something that was a microaggression that I didn't realize was a microaggression, et cetera, et cetera. So I just kind of wanted to give y'all that context because I think that is a big kind of teaching in its own right. Just that even when we're doing our best, sometimes it's not going to be aligned with our values. But then from that place, we always get to choose what to do from there, which is like, I'm choosing to re-record this podcast. And I'm so grateful to my podcast team for pointing this out. And I'm so grateful for them like telling me today. So I had enough time to re-record and time for you all to get this on the day it should be released to you. And yeah, it's such an example of how something that could be painful and like is a little painful to me still because I am a little embarrassed. But it mostly is not painful. It's mostly like something now that's a symbol of gratitude and delight and like a way that I can improve what I'm doing in the world and what I'm delivering to you that feels really meaningful to me and like aligned with my values. So that's what I wanted to share with y'all. And now let's get into the topic of the podcast, which I've now switched from the language I was using before that I'm now choosing not to use because it's been brought to my attention again that it's ableist, which was when everything feels dumb. And if you didn't know that dumb is ableist language, I invite you to look that up and be educated alongside of me. And then you can also make new choices about the language you want to use. And the new language we're going to use is when everything feels annoying and like when you're just not feeling it and when you just don't feel like using coaching. And those are all kind of different ideas, but I think they go together in what I want to talk about because what I want to talk about is really kind of about when we're feeling really resistant towards reality and resistant towards using our coaching and like we kind of just want to be stubborn and stuck in our current thinking, even if that thinking feels terrible and isn't helping us. As I mentioned before, part of why I wanted to talk about this with y'all is because it was an experience that I'd been having lately. I got some coaching from my own coach, Maggie Reyes, where I was just like thinking that everything was really annoying. And it's like, I'm a coach. So obviously I was like, these are thoughts and I could change them, but I was kind of like, I don't want to. And again, like it's kind of vulnerable for me to share with you that I sometimes am like, I know it's my thoughts and I don't want to change them and everything is irritating and I just don't like any of it. But I have days and moments like that too. And the beauty of coaching is that even when we're in that headspace, coaching can still be useful. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Another way we could word this is just like when you don't like something, right? Like when you're having the thought, I don't like this. I don't like this. I don't want to choose to like it. And then we get stuck in that headspace of like, I don't like it. I don't want to choose to like it. I guess there's nothing I can do. When what I'm going to offer you today is that there is still so much you can do. So let's take this example. Let's actually take that language. I don't like this, or this is irritating. This is annoying. And like, let's think about what some examples could be. So one example could be a male coworker getting paid more for doing the same job, or even getting paid more for doing a job that is technically like your job is more senior to their job. And this happens all the time. And I think it's a good example of something that you might feel really resistant to, like letting go of the thought that it's wrong or it's annoying or you don't like it. Another example could be working on a project for 6 months and like working really hard to showcase your skills and everything you're doing. And then that project getting canceled and then it never coming to completion. So you're not able to speak about it and write about it in the same way, like in performance reviews, let's say, or like get kind of like the credit for having done that work, or even like get the fulfillment of seeing it come to fruition. And instead it's just like canceled and you're expected to start working on something else. And I've seen this happen a lot, and I've seen people get like really downtrodden over it. So I think it's a good example for this. Another example is presenting a pitch to the leadership team where you are like addressing a problem you see in your workplace and even giving them like a really clear direction of like how that problem could be solved. And then them giving you raving like reviews and such positive feedback and then not doing anything about it. And a year later, they're like, why is blah, 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 like blah, blah, blah. And you're like, I don't know, maybe for the exact reasons I said in my pitch 1 year ago that you agreed with me, but then no one did anything about. And that's not something I've personally experienced, but I know a lot of people who have, and they find that generally to be really frustrating, really annoying. They don't like it, etc. So the thing about this is like the classic coaching is we can like look at these thoughts we're having and we can like question and interrogate them. And that's obviously available and can even be wise in some situations. But if you're in a headspace like I was in recently where you don't want to do that or you're feeling really resistant to that, I think it's useful to have another way we can approach this. Having many ways to approach something, I think it's always useful. And often there is an approach that's like, this could be a really wise approach, but sometimes we're not going to do the approach that could be really wise. And then it's useful just to have other ways we could approach it. And I think it's also like a great lesson in not being a perfectionist about how you coach yourself and about how you do thought work. To not say like, oh, well, I have to interrogate all of these thoughts. And if I'm not going to do that, then I'm stuck with this feeling and then just feeling stuck and hating it and being mad. Versus what I want to offer to you is kind of just this idea of like, okay, what if we just allow that assessment to be there? That assessment being like the thought, this is wrong, this is annoying, I don't like this, et cetera, et cetera. What if we allow that to be there, but then we don't stay there and we go to like, now what? Right? So with the way we think about things, it's like there's layers. So everything is annoying is a thought that might not be serving you. But if you're at a place where you can't get underneath that thought or you don't want to, then it can be a question of like, okay, everything is annoying and what? Right? Then it can become a question of everything is annoying and what do we want to do about that? Everything is annoying and what do we want to think about that? everything is annoying and how are we going to love ourselves through this situation where everything is annoying? So on the one hand, not questioning that everything is annoying, like there's a way to take the thought work deeper by questioning that, but there's also thought work that can be done when we're not willing to question that, right? So for instance, if you're like, everything is annoying, okay, sure. Let's just like say that's true. Everything is annoying. What do we want to do about it? Who do we want to be as a person with this everything that's annoying? Like, how do we want to show up? What kind of life do we want to live? And I think that this can actually be really useful because, at least for me, there's so much stuff in this world that like I don't agree with and I don't condone and I don't want. And sometimes I do want to keep my thoughts that it's annoying or wrong or that I don't like it. But I don't want to just be like, it's annoying and wrong and I don't like it and it's here. So now I have to like live in a pit of despair and give up and not do anything. And I see a lot of people kind of get stuck in that space of like, well, everything's annoying. And then they add on to that. So like nothing I do matters. And then so they don't do anything and then things stay the same. And then they feel more and more helpless versus like, yeah, let's just give it to you that many things are annoying, but like, okay, what do we want to do about that? Like, what do we want to do about having a male coworker who makes more money for the same work? Like, if we're like, everything's annoying and like, this is annoying, but everywhere we could work is like that and like, it'll never get better, then we're probably going to stay in that situation and be resentful and get burned out emotionally and just be annoyed with our lives, which, listen, is an option. You're totally allowed to do that if you want. I just don't think it sounds like very much fun. It's not what I want to be doing with my life, but I understand why it can be very tempting. Versus, okay, like such and such gets paid more than me and I'm annoyed about that. And what the fuck am I going to do about it? Am I going to put together a pitch to my supervisor to get a raise? Am I going to go out and find another job? Am I going to find a different job within this company? Am I going to leave this field altogether and start some kind of like interesting nonprofit about pay equality, like, or pay equity rather? Like, what am I going to do? Who do we want to be? And like, what if we choose something so we don't get stuck in the like, it's all terrible, nothing will get better, I may as well do nothing. So we don't get stuck in that place, which I'm just going to call the pit of despair. Although there are lots of pits of despair and lots of ways to end up there, I definitely think that that is one when we think that like everything is annoying and we don't like anything and there's no point. And that kind of ties back into like the podcast we've had recently about like the fuck it effect and self-sabotage. When we're like, everything's annoying and there's nothing I can do, then we don't do anything. And in a lot of ways, that actually, I would say, is a form of self-sabotage as well. Okay. So basically, to summarize, what I'm saying is if you have an unhelpful thought that it's difficult for you to shake, sometimes an easier thing to do versus interrogating it or like doing a list of what's working, those are both useful. But if like you don't want to do those things or like they're not feeling helpful in this moment, another thing you can do is just like, for now, allow that like unhelpful thought. And then what are we going to tag onto it? Who do we want to be? What values do we want to live by? How do we want to show up in spite of this thing, whatever it is that we think is annoying? Okay, so that's like the basic premise, but here's a little bonus thing I want y'all to think about. So often with coaching, with my own clients, but I've also seen this a lot with myself, we can kind of get into this place where we're like battling with our own brains. We're like, oh, my brain is an asshole. Why is it like this? It's like making everything hard for me. It keeps telling me everything's annoying. It's like we get this antagonistic, almost like relationship with ourselves, with these different parts of ourselves, like inside our own heads that like have these narratives that we have learned about coaching. We know these things aren't helpful. But what I want to offer to you is the exact opposite, which is like, what if we can love and include these parts of ourselves that have these unhelpful thoughts? And that might feel really counterintuitive at first. You're like, no, Corey, you told me that these thoughts that aren't helpful lead to feelings that aren't helpful, which leads to actions that aren't helpful, which lead to a lot of shit I don't want in my life. And listen, that's all true. But I don't think excluding those parts of ourselves helps us rewire them into more useful thoughts. And I don't think excluding those parts of ourselves like helps us have a fun, integrated life, because we're constantly then battling with ourselves and we're like on the lookout against ourselves of like, oh no, when is that problematic part of me going to come around and fuck everything up because it's an asshole and it doesn't want me to succeed. I see this a lot with like people's relationship to like what they're going to call their inner critic, right? So the way I have been starting to think about this is like thinking about these parts of myself as all wanting to be really helpful, but many of them being confused about what it means to be really helpful. So if I have a part of me that's saying something that I think isn't helpful, can I see that part of me and not just think, well, that part's an asshole, but instead think like, what is that part of me trying to help me achieve? And it's just using this concept that I don't like subscribe to anymore, right? So if part of me is saying like everything is annoying, that doesn't sound helpful. It doesn't feel good, but is it possible that the part of me that's saying that is trying to be helpful and it's just using this concept that's not helpful? And if it is trying to be helpful, like what's it trying to help me by doing? Like what is it trying to offer me? I think a thought like everything is annoying might be trying to offer me, maybe that part of me like wants to grieve about the things that aren't going the way it wants them to. Maybe that part of me like wants to be mad for a little bit about the things that aren't going the way it wants them to. Maybe that part of me like has big dreams, but is afraid like we're not going to get to do those and is looking around for someone to blame. So all the different like parts of us were socialized just like we were, right? So like I think about them as like internal parts, which I think there's actually like a therapy that is like this, which is internal family systems, which I had an internal family systems therapist for a while. But it's like the different parts of you inside of you kind of pick up ideas from socialization too. It's like they pick up some shit your like third grade art teacher said to you, or they pick up some shit like a babysitter said to you in like 1997 or whatever. And they're parroting that back to you. But I personally like to believe that all those parts are trying to be helpful and help me have like a good life, but they're just confused about how to do that. And the reason I like to think this is because I have a better experience with myself and these internal parts when I do that. Like if I think this part's just trying to be an asshole, then I want to fight with that part and I want to exclude that part and I want to shut it out. But you can't shut out parts of yourself that are like literally inside of your own head. And I think when we try to, we just push those parts out of our consciousness and then they also fuck things up in like sort of self-sabotagey ways because they don't feel included. And, you know, it's kind of like, I imagine being at like a house party and everyone wants to come to the house party. But if we have these parts of ourselves we think are assholes, we're like, no, you're not allowed to go to the house party. And they're like standing outside the house party, like looking in the windows, being angry. And like, then they're like gonna like throw some rocks through the glass or like toilet paper the house or whatever. I don't know. This metaphor has gotten a little bit weird, but go with me on this. I think it makes more sense to include those parts and re-educate them about how to be helpful and what we want to choose to believe on purpose about the world. And to see all of them as like trying to help me live a great life, but they're confused about how to do that. But they are allowed to be confused because I am the one who's in charge and I am the one who decides what we're doing. And I can let them all be like kind of part of my party and still make the party go the way I want it to. And that things actually go better for me when I learn how to like integrate those parts versus trying to exclude them and like cut them out of my life. Because you, again, can't cut things out if they're part of your own thought patterns. Like those thought patterns are still going to happen. And so if they're going to happen, what if we just choose to relate to them on purpose? And what if we choose to relate to them lovingly, not because we're going to listen to what they're saying, but because I think that's just more effective than trying to battle them. Okay, so that's kind of a lot for today, but I think this can be really useful because I know a lot of people struggle with this because I see it with my clients and other people where they're like, I want to change my thoughts. I want to feel better, but I'm just like really struggling to like let go of this idea. And if that's where you are, like let yourself just have the fucking idea, but then just add something onto it that's going to help you have a better experience. And I think learning to see these little parts of ourselves that are like, think everything's annoying or think they don't like things as parts of us that could be useful and maybe just need some education and some love from us to figure out how to be useful versus like parts of us that are trying to destroy us that we need to like stamp out, because that's just not going to work. And it's going to make the inside of your head feel like always like a battle. So, all right, that's what I have for y'all today. Thanks so much. And I will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It. We'll have another episode for you next week. And in the meantime, if you're feeling super fired up, head on over to CoreyLynn.com for more guidance and resources.